Great. Thanks so much. And it's really nice to be with all of you today. And I have to say, it's a little daunting to think about a 4 hour time on Zoom. And this is one I really wish we were in, sitting around a table, having a conversation, but really hope that we can have a good conversation, and you're not just listening to me talk, and that hopefully that we'll find that the time just zooms right by. But I have worked with Jessica for many, many years now, and I won't say how many years, but it's, and whenever she calls and asks, I'm like, of course, I'll do whatever you want. So really happy to be talking with you. And as she said, I am the director of Alliance for Justice's Boulder Advocacy Program. And Alliance for Justice is an organization based in Washington, D.C., with a very broad mission of creating a vibrant democracy that values and protects a just and equitable society. And we carry out that very lofty vision in two ways. One is we have a program that works on and focuses on the importance of the courts, and primarily looking at the federal courts and the role that they play in our lives, and with whether it's the Supreme Court, whether it's the federal appeals courts, the district courts, have impact on people's lives, every day. And sometimes it's the big cases, like the Supreme Court heard a case yesterday on abortion, but oftentimes it's on much more mundane things about funding and relationship with government. And so really so we really look at who sits on the courts. And we've started a big project over the last year called Building the Bench, really trying to increase the diversity of people on the courts, and not just in terms of racial diversity, but also professional diversity. So it's not just, typically it tends to be people from big corporate law firms or prosecutors. And we've seen over the last even year, a lot more public defenders, people from nonprofits, people from the advocacy community, and people who more look like and represent the communities that the courts serve. So that's one big program. And then the other is our Boulder Advocacy Program. And through Boulder Advocacy, we are really the leading nonprofit resource for foundations and nonprofits who want to engage more actively and knowledgeably in the policymaking process. And we know that because of the complicated regulations, many organizations don't fully understand the many ways that they can advocate legally to policymakers. And many organizations don't even recognize or really see the important role that they as nonprofits should be having, and the appropriateness of them reaching out and talking with policymakers and being part of that policymaking process. And so our team, mostly of legal experts, but we also have some evaluation and capacity assessment staff as well, but work with organizations to help move from cautious to courageous, to think about how to get more involved in advocacy. And as we'll talk about, we really look at advocacy with a big lens. And so advocacy includes things like politics and elections. It includes lobbying, which is often that dirty word that people are like, oh, but it also includes, it includes ballot measures, but it also includes research. It includes relationship building with policymakers. It includes education efforts, and includes so much of the work that you're already funding, that your partners are doing. And I think so often groups think, oh, well, we're not doing advocacy, when actually they are. And so we really help organizations understand what's possible. And, as Jessica was saying, that today we're going to really focus on the legal constraints, I would actually flip that and say we're really going to focus on the legal opportunities. And I think too often in the nonprofit and philanthropic world, we focus on the constraints and think about all the things that we can't do. And there are some things that we can't do, and based on the type of foundation you're with or the type of organization, those rules will vary a little bit. But there's actually a lot more that most of us can do than we think. And as we'll talk about, maybe it doesn't look like the way you thought it will, or you can't say something in the exact way you want to, but there's often a way. And so we're really going to talk about what's possible. I'll also say that, my goal is for you to have an understanding of where the parameters are in terms of what's clearly legal, what's clearly not legal. Then there's a lot of gray in the middle. And I have some thoughts on, how groups and how funders can navigate that gray, but it's really, every foundation is at a different place, and every foundation, based on its culture, based on its mission, based on its relationship with grantees or other partners, needs to figure out for itself where it should be in that process. But what's so important is to know where those guardrails are, because so often what we see is funders and grantee organizations as well thinking that they can do so much less than they can do. And then when they say, okay, well, we don't want to be up against the line, we want to be a few steps back, then if you're a few steps back from the line, if you've already moved the goalpost back, then you're doing so much less than what's possible. So again, that's really what we want to talk about. And, I recognize that what this looks like for every foundation will be very different. And there's no one right size, there's no one right approach to advocacy, but it's really thinking about what makes sense and what works. So before I jump in and start getting into more of the details, I want to just sort of throw it open and sort of, I know there have been some questions, and we'll get into the difference between different types of organizations and the difference between private foundations and public charities, and even the difference between a traditional private foundation and a private operating foundation. There was a question about C4 organizations, but I want to just start and see if there are other questions that people have, other thoughts as you're, thinking about this of, that you want to make sure we include today.
Abby, I would love to learn about the possibilities for different types of organizations around lobbying.
Okay. Great.
Hi, Abby. I want to make sure I understand within affiliated organizations that may be operating under like shared services agreements or things like that, like what that process tends to look like to establish them, and what's good, bad, and ugly around what those look like.
Hi, good morning, Abby. If possible, I would love to learn about the distribution of public versus private charities, foundations, what have you, and if in recent years, in the last couple of decades, there have been any specific trends in what we're seeing in the distribution. Would love to hear your thoughts.
Sure. Interesting question.
Abby, can I add in a question about when you're working in coalition, sort of whose tax status wins, rules the day of what the coalition can do?
Yep. This is where it'd be good to have an old school of a good chalkboard easel to take notes. So hopefully, if I forget something, make sure you continually remind me, and we can add to this list as the day goes on.
I have a question. I want to, first of all, plus one Jessica's question about coalitions. I'd be very interested in that. And then my other question is really with foundations, particularly private foundations, what's their ability to fund and support grassroots organizations and efforts? What's the limitations?
Okay.
Yeah, and I might add to that, Abby, we wrestle with this issue a lot, which is how can we make a grant to an organization for them to do what they can do legally? What are the tactics that we might use to be able to make the grant so that they can pursue the mission and not cross the line?
Great.
So my question is probably around the supporting organization structure. Is that different than, what, perhaps my colleagues can do in their foundation?
Okay. All right. Well, why don't we go ahead and I will, let's see, can I share my screen? Jess, can I share my screen? And please just jump in whenever you have questions. Don't wait for me. Don't feel like you'll be interrupting. If there's something that we'll definitely get to later, I may say that, but you really, I don't want to have me talk for an hour or so and then, so.
I think you should be good now, Abby.
Okay, perfect. Now it just requires my tech skills or lack thereof to do this. Okay, so we've already talked about some of the highlights, and I will also send these slides out, so don't feel like you have to take copious notes. I sort of started with, and I'll go through these pretty quickly because I talked about most of these. But one of the things is, thinking about the role of philanthropy and thinking about advocacy is that, advocacy is a strategy. It's a tool to be able to accomplish the missions of your foundations. We don't do advocacy, or we shouldn't do advocacy just to do it. It should be a way to, get to what you want to be able to do. And I want to be very clear that as much as I'm an advocate for advocacy, and as much as we think that advocacy is often one of the key strategies in your philanthropic toolbox, I recognize that the provision of direct services is also critical. And too often, I think we get caught in this dichotomy of, well, should we be providing direct services or advocacy? And if we're supposed to be doing advocacy, then we're not providing services. And that's really a false dichotomy. And in many cases, the groups on the ground that are working most with the community, that are providing services, and the people who are the best, that are the recipients of the services, make the best advocates. And so it's really about how do we better combine all of the work and think about all the different strategies for funders to be able to accomplish their goals. And I make this point because a number of years ago, I was working with some funders in another state, and they had done a survey of whether the funders had been engaged in advocacy, and if not, why not? And not surprising, one of the reasons why many foundations said they didn't engage in advocacy was because they didn't understand the legal rules. That I understood. That's what keeps me in business. That's why our program exists. Gives me good job security, unfortunately. But what I was really surprised by was one of the answers where a lot of funders said, well, we don't engage in advocacy because it's not related to our mission. And that just really made me pause, sort of made me want to cry, and made me realize that, again, clearly we're not talking about advocacy in the right way. So I don't think that, I think you're all part of this cohort talking about advocacy, but just really wanted to make that point. As we'll get into, it is legal for all of you, whether you're with a private foundation, whether you're with a public charity, to engage in advocacy, to fund other organizations to engage in advocacy. And frankly, it's even legal for you all, again, whether you're with a private foundation or a public charity, to fund lobbying. So it gets into the nuance in how you go about doing it, but there's a way. And so again, just to be clear that all of you can fund and engage in advocacy. And as we'll get into, the real nuance isn't about whether you're funding or engaging in advocacy. It gets into where we draw the line between advocacy and lobbying, and advocacy and supporting or opposing candidates for public office. And there is a huge difference. There are many entry points and roles for foundations. So the way the Kauffman Foundation approaches advocacy could be very different than the way the Walton Family Foundation does it, or the Hall Family Foundation, or the Community Foundation. And what you're doing today may look very different than what you did 5 years ago, may look very different than what you do tomorrow. There's no right or wrong. It's really for every foundation to figure out what makes sense for you now, and to recognize that every bit matters. You know, sometimes I'll talk to funders where they're like, oh, well, we don't have, we can't have a full-time staff person, or we don't have millions of dollars that we can grant for advocacy, so what's the point? Well, if you talk to groups on the ground, for some groups, getting $1,000 grant could be huge. Or having a funder say, we want to learn more about your advocacy can be really important. So again, there's so many different ways to do this, that while it's really good to hear what other funders are doing, and to be able to know that, you're not alone in this, you also don't have to do it just like somebody else does. And then finally, we will think about risk and thinking about what those, some of those constraints are. And it's important to be thoughtful so you can, do things in the way that, that the law provides so many ways for us to do what we want to do. And the law provides so many ways for funders to legally engage, that the more we can focus on what's possible, the more effective you can be, the more bold you can be, the more you can do, and feel safe about it. So again, so often I think the conversation, and this is not just among foundations, but it's among nonprofits as well, of, oh, well, getting involved in advocacy, that's risky, or and yes, there may be some risk to it, but also really want you to think about what's the risk of not getting involved. And if you think about the mission of your foundation, if you think about the work that you're doing, why you give out money, why you do the work that you do, can that really be accomplished without advocacy? And recognizing that, even with all the foundations in this country, there's not enough money to solve all of the social ills. And no foundation, can really grant its way or add, to solve everything that you want to accomplish, or to do everything you want to accomplish. So, often thinking about that, yes, there may be some risk, but the real risk is if the communities that are most impacted, the communities that your foundation is created to serve, aren't part of the policymaking process, aren't at the table when decisions that affect their lives are being made, then what? And I think that's, as we often see, that's where the real risk comes to play. So that's sort of the summary of big picture of what we're going to talk about. And now I'll really move into sort of the legal nuts and bolts, the real sort of geeky stuff about what's possible. And I recognize that, when we think about what we can do, much of it comes down to tax law. And, I bet most of you, maybe none of you, got involved in this work, joined a foundation, got involved in the nonprofit sector because you really cared about tax law, right? I mean, most people are like, oh, what is tax law? I do nonprofit, so I don't have to think about taxes or things like that. But that's really at the heart of what we do, of the rules that are created. And so much of what we can do and how our organizations are structured are based on tax law. And so much is based on sort of how we're defined. As we'll get into, and again, as I've made this point before, and it's probably not the best place for this slide, the law doesn't regulate advocacy. And I'm just going to keep making this point. You'll be sick of this point by the end. The law doesn't regulate advocacy. The law regulates lobbying, and the law regulates political activity, supporting or opposing candidates. Figuring out where those lines are and how we differentiate them is what's really important. So here we go. Let's start with some good old tax law. And again, please just jump in whenever you have questions. So there are a lot of different types of tax exempt organizations in this country. And what that means is an entity that doesn't have to pay federal income tax. Many of those organizations are 501c3 organizations. Those are the most common type of 501s, of the most common types of tax exempt organizations. But there are actually over 30 different types of tax exempt entities in the tax code. And some of you may have, 529 college savings plans. That's a tax exempt organization. There are veterans organizations. There are cemetery organizations. It's fascinating to see all the different types of tax exempt organizations. But there are over 30 different types that are all created for different purposes and have different opportunities, different challenges that go along with them. When we think about nonprofits, most of the time we're thinking about 501c3 organizations. And because the tax law, because Congress, can't make anything simple, there are actually two types of 501c3 organizations, or it's actually been divided into two types of entities. So 501c3 organizations are the most common type of tax exempt organization in this country. By far, the vast majority of tax exempt organizations are 501c3s. And again, that's what the public, that's what the media, that's what policymakers think about when they think about nonprofits. These are organizations that are created for scientific, charitable, educational, religious purposes. So all of you are with a 501c3 organization, maybe with the exception of Jess and Rita, but are with 501c3 organizations, Little Leagues, Girl Scouts, universities, hospitals are 501c3 organizations. They don't have to pay federal taxes. There's no income tax on that they have to pay. In addition, 501c3 organizations have this great advantage that contributions to 501c3 organizations are tax deductible to the donor. So if a donor, if an individual, if a corporation makes a contribution to a 501c3 organization, they are eligible to receive a tax deduction, assuming they itemize. There are a lot of assumptions that go with that, but donors can receive tax deductions for giving to 501c3 organizations. With the exception of certain veterans organizations, 501c3 organizations are the only type of tax exempt organization that can receive those contributions, those tax deductible contributions. So being a 501c3 organization is key. Contributions are tax deductible both for private foundations and for community and for public charities, although the percentage is a little bit different. So 501c3 organizations are these charitable, educational, scientific organizations. They're created to benefit the broad public and to serve broad public benefits. All 501c3 organizations are absolutely prohibited from supporting or opposing candidates for public office. So all 501c3 organizations cannot support or oppose candidates for public office. And we'll come back and we'll talk more about that. But then the tax code and there's some differences between private foundations and public charities. And this is that every organization, when it's created, is deemed to be a private foundation unless and until it can show that it qualifies to be a public charity. And an entity can show that it qualifies as a public charity by either being a hospital or an education, a school, or a religious organization, a church or religious organization, or it can show that it has broad public support. So the real difference is that private foundations money comes from an individual, a corporation, a family. It's from a very limited pool of sources. And so the Kauffman Foundation money comes from Kauffman family, or Ewing Marion Kauffman himself. The Hall Family Foundation, the funds come from the family, and often have more limited, and often the family sort of controls how the foundation operates. Public charities, on the other hand, whether they're groups like the Community Foundation or groups like Kansas Action for Children, receive funding from a wide variety of sources. So they may receive grants from foundations, may receive government grants, may receive fee from service, contributions from lots of individuals. And that's really the difference between private foundations and public charities. So entities are either a private foundation or a public charity. And it really, for the most part, comes down to what is the source of funding? Where does the money come from? Private foundations are subject to more limitations. So private foundations, probably what people think most about for private foundations is that private foundations have a payout requirement. So private foundations need to spend at least 5% of their assets each year. Public charities don't have that payout requirement. Private foundations are subject to some additional rules on self-dealing between officers and directors of the foundation. Public charities are not subject to those same self-dealing rules. So there are more limitations that apply to private foundations than apply to public charities. Another one of the big differences has to do with lobbying. Public charities, and again, whether it's a group like Alliance for Justice, whether it's the Greater Kansas City Community Foundation, whether it's Kansas Action for Children, whether public charities can lobby. I'm going to admit Monica Nielsen into the room. Public charities can lobby. We'll talk, there are limits to how much public charities can do, and we'll talk about those limits. Private foundations, on the other hand, are subject to more limitations. And private foundations are subject to excise taxes on any money that they spend on lobbying, any money that's spent on grants to individuals, any money that's spent on voter registration drives, unless they're done in certain ways. And so this is where the distinction between what private foundations and public charities can do. It's because private foundations, again, are subject to these additional rules. And we'll go through and tease out what all of this means. One of the questions that somebody asked earlier was the difference between what's a private, sort of a traditional private foundation and an operating foundation. Operating foundations are also private foundations and are subject to most of the same rules that apply to private foundations. And so private operating foundations are subject to the same limitations on lobbying. The difference is that operating foundations are not subject to the payout requirement. Operating foundations tend to spend their money by carrying out programs themselves, rather than making grants to other organizations. So while most foundations, like the Kauffman Foundation, is subject to the 5% payout requirement each year, operating foundations don't have to meet that payout requirement. But in pretty much all other purposes, they're treated the same as private foundations. And we'll come back and, again, really tease out, what we mean by these limits for lobbying, what foundations can do, what public charities can do, talking more about electoral activity. But I also want to mention, as we've talked about, there are other different types of tax exempt organizations, including 501c4 organizations. And these are entities that are referred to in the code as social welfare organizations, a term that is used a lot that really has very little meaning. The IRS can't actually define what it means to engage in social welfare, but these are typically what we see as advocacy organizations. 501c4 organizations are also tax exempt, so they don't pay federal income tax, but contributions to C4s are not tax deductible. And whenever a 501c4 organization raises money, it needs to specifically say contributions are not tax deductible. So C4 organizations often have a harder time raising money. And often they raise money from people who give because they care about the cause, and it's not so much about the tax deduction. C4 organizations often, not always, but often are structured as membership organizations. And there are some reasons under campaign finance law where that could be a benefit, but it also is a way to help generate revenue for the C4 for those C4s that collect membership dues. So C4 organizations, you can't receive these tax deductible contributions. Traditionally, foundations have been very, very wary of giving to 501c4 organizations. That's starting to change. And one of those trends that we've seen is that there has been, over the last 6 months to a year, I've talked to so many more foundations who want to learn about 501c4s and want to understand how they can support C4 organizations. But it's still, we still see, again, most C4 organizations don't receive grants from C4s currently. But C4s can do more with the money that they raise. So C4 organizations can do as much lobbying as they want. The sole purpose of a C4 organization can be lobbying. And so that's huge. And C4 organizations can support or oppose candidates for public office. Doing so can't be their primary purpose. It can't be their main activity. It can't be their only activity, but to a certain degree, C4s can support or oppose candidates. Yeah, Candace.
Hey, sorry, I don't know if like the
Constance, I'm sorry.
Oh, no worries at all. I always wonder about the raise hand feature. Should I just button? Okay, so this is bringing up a lot of memories from my last position, which as a community organizer, we were talking about the differences between C3, C4, PAC, and then Super PAC, because we had Super PAC as well. So, okay, so from what I'm hearing you say, the range of activities is pretty wide with C4s. They could do everything that a C3 could do plus more.
Correct.
Okay. So in your experience, do you find, because I'm trying to understand this, then does it generally seem like C4 organizations spend more time doing things that are exclusively C4 just because they can, and it would be like a waste to do C3 activities? I'm just curious.
No, that's a great question. And I'll just say, as you referenced PACs, political organizations are also tax exempt, which people may be surprised by. And that's everything from candidate committees to the Republican Senate Campaign Committee, to groups like the Sierra Club PAC or the Emily's List. They are tax exempt under Section 527 of the tax code, and which again means they don't receive tax deductible, which they don't have to pay federal income tax, but contributions to political organizations are not tax deductible. There are a lot of different types of political organizations, and that, as you mentioned, Constance, there are sort of traditional PACs that raise money, and individuals can give money to, subject to certain contribution limits, to a PAC, and then PACs often make campaign contributions to candidates. There are also super PACs that are officially what are called independent expenditure only PACs, which actually don't make contributions to candidates, but can make endorsements and other types of public communications about candidates. So there are a lot of different types of PACs. What's important is, and what we're seeing so much of these days, is that they're often organizations, part of sort of affiliated organizations, where organizations have a public charity. So in this case, I was looking for organizations in the education field. Sort of, I don't know what you all think of this organization, but there's Excel in Ed, which is a 501c3, and then there's Excel in Ed in Action, which is a C4. We at Alliance for Justice are a 501c3. We have the Alliance for Justice Action Fund, or Action Campaign, which is a 501c4. And organization, and then oftentimes where a 501c4 will then have an affiliated political organization. You never want to have a C3 can never have an affiliated 527 political organization. The social welfare organizations, C4s, can do everything that a C3 can. And in fact, have to do C3 activity, because the stuff that they also can do, where they can support or oppose candidates, they can do, can't be the primary purpose of the C4. So you can't have a C4 that's only doing C4 only activities. So you could not have a C4 that's only supporting or opposing candidates. A big piece of what at least half of the work of the C4 has to be work that the C3 itself could do. And that could be lobbying. And so some C4 and some more affiliated organizations actually make the decision that all of the lobbying is done by the C4. And there are some organizations, if you talk to somebody at the Sierra Club, they talk about lobbying as a C4 activity. And because for them, they've made the strategic decision to do all their lobbying from a C4. It doesn't mean that a C3, that they couldn't do it from the C3, but they've chosen to do it from the C4. Partly to be able to fulfill that primary purpose mission of the C4. And this is, I think, one of the question that you raised is one of the struggles and one of the, I think, the biggest issues that groups grapple with, of wanting to sort of maximize those C4 dollars and wanting to do C4 activities with it, but then recognizing that they also have to do some work that could be done from the C3. And so that's a really strategic discussion. And sometimes that's easy for groups to say, all right, some of this work could be done from the C3, but we're going to do it from the C4. Sometimes it's really a struggle for organizations, but C4s do need to make sure they're doing work that, yes, could be done from the C3, but if they want to do political stuff, has to be done from the C4 as well. Did that answer your question, or did that just go?
No, thank you. That was that's really helpful. Like I'm like visualizing it out in my head. So if I hear you right, then so C4s need to have at least 50% of their activities be classified as C3. Is that right?
Essentially.
Okay.
Or non-political. And so, so it could be lobbying. So again, a C4 could do, so C3s can lobby up to certain limitations. A C4 can do as much lobbying as they want.
I would add in here too, just a strategic note, that I think one of the real tricks for foundations and nonprofits in this space is to not let your tax status dictate your activities, but actually acknowledge that all of these tax statuses are just tools to what you think they are strategies. So, if you have a lot of clarity about what you're trying to do and the strategies that you think are needed to get there, then you can start thinking about what vehicles and tools you already have and which ones you need to get there. But I think backing into it by saying I just would reinforce Abby's initial point that ultimately these are all strategies that you can use to impact your mission, and using whatever tax status you need to have to get there is just good grant making and good strategy. But there's so much opportunity if you see a strategy that needs to be happening to find a way to make it happen.
So before we move on, I have a question that I'm hopefully will not get us into the weeds.
Yeah.
But just thinking of our early education landscape and, who shows up in our Partners of Quality meetings. I'm thinking of the Greater Kansas City Chamber of Commerce, which is the C6. And, one of their big 5 initiatives is kindergarten readiness. So to me, I see them as, perhaps potential partners in this space. So if you were to add another 501c6
Yep.
column to this chart, what would that look like in terms of their
Sure.
ability to engage with us?
That's
in
a
some of these
great question.
activities?
I apologize. I meant to talk about that. So 501c6 organizations follow essentially the same rules for advocacy as 501c4s, as do labor unions that are 501c5 organizations. And we often talk about in the advocacy space, sort of they're the 501c3s and then they're the 501cs. And because 501c4s, 501c5s, 501c6s sort of essentially all follow the same rules. And a lot of the work that they do is work that C3s can do. We, oftentimes, and I've talked to a lot and gotten lots of calls from organizations who are like, well, we're a C3. We've been invited to this meeting and we know there are going to be some C6s or C4s there. We can't go, right? And it's like, no, you can't. C3s can sit at a table with C4s, with C6s. It all depends on what the activity is. And there are many times when C4s, C5, C6s are doing public education, are doing activities that aren't considered to be lobbying. A lot of what they do isn't political. The big issue is, or when C3s need to be cautious, is if the C4, C5, C6 starts talking about, all right, how are we going to get this candidate elected? That's when the C3s need to step aside. But for the most part, there are a lot of ways that organizations can work with these other types of organizations, and I think can actually get a lot more done by working with other types of organizations. And again, recognizing, as Jess was just saying, it really takes a village, to do this type of work, and it requires all of the different tax status types organizations to make policy change happen. And and having, and sometimes C3s sit there and go like, oh, well, we're a C3, we can't do certain things. Oh, woe is me. Where it's like, in some way, that's good. I can't get everything on my to-do list done, let alone all the other things that I would want to do. So a C3 can really focus on all of the things that are really in its wheelhouse and know that other partner organizations, whether it's a C6 or a C4, can take on some of those other entities or some of those other activities. The other piece that I just should mention is that increasingly we're seeing, and this gets back to one of the questions about grassroots organizations, as different groups are coming together, are sometimes recognizing that they're not, they're not sure how long-term they're going to be, or for a variety of reasons, they're not their own sort of freestanding organization that gets its own C3 status. And we're seeing a lot more organizations that are part of that have a fiscal sponsor, where they basically take the tax exempt status of their fiscal sponsor. And it's really important that if you're working with groups that have fiscal sponsors, that the project needs to understand what its fiscal sponsor status is, and they need to make sure they're talking with the fiscal sponsor to understand what its rules are, what its policies are, and that fiscally sponsored projects aren't their own sort of freestanding entities, but need to make sure that they are that they understand what the fiscally sponsored organization's rules are. Any other question? I know I can feel like I can just ramble on, sort of talking about some of this for. So why don't we move into, and I want to start really getting into, as we can see, so much of this, and when we think about so as we look at this and say that, okay, public charities can lobby subject to limitations. Private foundations are subject to very prohibitive taxes on lobbying. C4 organizations can do as much lobbying as they want. All of this then really comes down to what is considered to be lobbying. Because if the activity doesn't fit within the definition of lobbying, it's not subject to this regulatory scheme. Because again, federal tax law, which governs all of us as 501c3 organizations or as tax exempt organizations, doesn't govern and doesn't regulate advocacy. It regulates lobbying, it regulates campaign intervention. So figuring out where those lines are is really important. So again, so much of the policy work that organizations do, and much of the policy work that you as funders do, that your grantees do, may be considered advocacy, but don't fit within the narrow definition of lobbying. And as we'll get into, federal tax law has a very narrow definition of what constitutes lobbying. And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about what constitutes lobbying. So for public charities, okay, are you going to do something that's lobbying? But it's also really important for private foundations, because again, if something isn't lobbying, then it's not subject to the restrictions. And so again, as with so much of this, we're defining things by what they're not. So we'll spend a lot of time talking about what constitutes lobbying, because if something doesn't meet the definition of lobbying, then it's not regulated. So again, it's just important to know that so much of the work, and as we'll get into, whether it's doing research, whether it's trying to influence corporate behavior, building relationships with legislators, community organizing, isn't considered to be lobbying. So let's get into sort of the nitty-gritty about what's considered to be lobbying. Now, before I get into the definition of lobbying, I'm going to talk about what the lobbying limits are. Now, again, private foundations can't lobby. And I should say that technically nowhere in the tax code does it say a private foundation can't lobby. Instead, what the law says is that private foundations are subject to very heavy excise taxes on any money that they spend on lobbying. And it's not only the foundation itself that's subject to the tax, but any of the foundation's officers and trustees that approve the spending. And that's essentially what serves as the prohibition. I've never met a foundation officer or trustee that's like, sure, I'll pay that excise tax, because it's a personal tax. And it could be up to the amount of money that's spent. So what that means is that a private foundation, and so Tim, as a staff member of the Kauffman Foundation, can't, as part of your work, you can't spend money directly lobbying. Your staffed salary, while you're paid, can't spend money on lobbying. The foundation, as we'll get into, can't fund organizations specifically to lobby. But there are a lot of ways that even private foundations can fund organizations that lobby. But this is really about that the foundation itself can't spend money specifically for lobbying. Public charities, on the other hand, can lobby. And there are two ways that public charities can determine their limits. There's what's called the insubstantial part test, and there's the 501h expenditure test. The insubstantial part test comes directly from the tax code that says no substantial part of the activities of the organization can be to influence legislation, which doesn't really tell us a whole lot. So under this test, we know that public charities can lobby as long as it's not a substantial part of their activities. But there is actually no definition of what substantial is. And under this test, it looks at all of the activities of an organization and really anything that's done to support or oppose a bill, which is really, really broad. So this insubstantial part test doesn't really provide a lot of clarity for organizations. On the other hand, the 501H expenditure test provides a lot more guidance for public charities in terms of how much lobbying they can do and what counts as lobbying. There are very clear definitions of what count as lobbying under the 501H expenditure test. There's a clear formula for how much money organizations can spend on lobbying. And under this test, as the name implies, it only looks at how much money organizations are spending. It doesn't look at all of the organization's activities. The other piece that's, I think, really important about the 501H expenditure test is that when there are clear definitions of what counts as lobbying under this definition, these are the same definitions that apply to private foundations in terms of what doesn't count as lobbying. So these 501H definitions apply to those public charities that choose to use this 501H expenditure test, and they are the same definitions that apply to private foundations. So again, public charities can lobby. There are limits, but the limits are actually a lot more generous than most people think. So for many public charities, they can actually spend up to 20% of their total annual spending on lobbying, which is a lot. And so you may hear groups say, oh, well, there's a 20% test, or where there's a 15% test for lobbying. And it comes from this 501H expenditure test. And organizations on the smaller side can spend up to 20% of their total spending on lobbying. And then as the size of the organization increases, the percentage decreases a little bit. And then you can see that under this test, no organization, no matter how large it is, can ever spend more than $1 million of lobbying in a given year. And that $1 million cap was put into the law when it was written in 1976 and has not been indexed for inflation. So under the insubstantial part test, there's no clear definition of what's substantial, but based on some very vague guidance over the years, most lawyers encourage organizations to spend no more than 3 to 5% of their activities on lobbying. So under the insubstantial part test, we have 3 to 5% of activities, where under the 501H expenditure test, organizations may be able to spend 10, 15% of spending on lobbying. So organizations can do a lot more under this 501H expenditure test. And one of the great things that you as funders can do is work to educate your grantees about the 501H expenditure test. Too often, and it's something that you can do, that doesn't cost you any money, doesn't count as lobbying, but can provide a huge impact. And one of the questions we hear most from grantees as they're thinking about lobbying and as they're learning about this, they're like, oh, but if we make the 501H expenditure test, will that make funders not want to fund us? Or does that put us, does that make our funders at risk? And it doesn't. And in fact, as funders, having your grantees use the 501H expenditure test should give you sort of comfort that your grantees have a sense of what the rules are, have a better sense of how to comply, and that you'll be essentially talking the same language. So one of the great things that funders can do is to educate your grantees about this, to ask whether grantees have made the 501H expenditure test, and let them know that it's okay for them to do that. So I'm just going to move forward. So I want to just really focus on the definition, start really getting into the definition of lobbying. And the definitions under the insubstantial part test are really broad. It's, really anything that supports or opposes a bill. Who the heck knows what that means? So most of what we're going to focus on now is really what constitutes lobbying under the 501H expenditure test. And again, when the law says private foundations are subject to a tax on money spent on lobbying, the regulations sort of loop back to these 501H definitions. So what we're talking about now, as I go through these definitions, apply both to public charities that use this 501H definition, but they also apply to you as private foundations. And again, for private foundations, even though you may be saying, well, we can't lobby, again, knowing what the definition is really important, because if the activity doesn't fit within this narrow definition, then you can do it. So the law breaks lobbying down into two types. There's direct lobbying and there's grassroots lobbying. For private foundations, there's really not a huge, the distinction is thinking about, do you meet these definitions? For public charities, there's more of the consequence of whether something's direct lobbying or grassroots lobbying is more significant. For reasons that make no sense, when Congress wrote these laws, they said that an organization can spend its entire lobbying limit on direct lobbying, but can only spend a quarter of its lobbying limit on grassroots lobbying. So public charities need to track not only how much money they're spending on lobbying, but they need to track whether they're spending it on direct lobbying or grassroots lobbying. For private foundations, it's just important to know, does something that you're doing meet the definition of lobbying? And if so, it's probably something that you shouldn't do. So I'm going to start by, there are a lot of similarities between what's direct lobbying and what's grassroots lobbying, but the biggest difference has to do with the audience. Direct lobbying is a communication with legislators. On the other hand, grassroots lobbying is where an organization is communicating with the general public. But I'm now going to walk through these definitions in all of these elements in a little bit more detail. So in order for something to be lobbying, first of all, there needs to be a communication. You can sit with your colleagues and talk all you want about what you think should happen. But if it never leaves the confines of the organization, it's definitely not lobbying. So the first element is there needs to be a communication. And a communication can take any form. It could be an email, it can be a personal meeting, it could be a tweet, but there needs to be a communication. Then the communication needs to be with a legislator. And legislators are members of legislative bodies. And most of the time, sorry, I thought I added a slide in here on that, but apparently I took it out. So legislators are, most of the time when we think about legislators, it's members of Congress, members of the state Senate or the state House, members of city council. It's legislators at every level of government. And it's both the elected legislators themselves and their staff. So most of the time when we're thinking about legislators, it's communicating with a member of a legislative body. But the law defines legislator a bit broader than that. So it also includes executive branch officials when they are participating in the formulation of legislation. So if you're communicating with the governor and you ask the governor to veto a bill, for that purpose, the governor, because vetoing a bill is part of is determining whether the bill passes or fails, they're considered to be a legislator for those purposes. So for lobbying, we need to be communicating with a legislator. And then the communication, but simply communicating with a legislator isn't enough. And a lot of the communications that organizations have with legislators isn't lobbying. Because in order for that communication to be lobbying, the communication with the legislator needs to express a view about specific legislation. And specific legislation includes bills that have been introduced. So things that have numbers, HR 3244. That's pretty clear that that's expressing a bill about specific legislation. The budget that needs to be confirmed, that needs to be approved by the legislature, is a piece of specific legislation. Nominations that need to be confirmed by the Senate, like who's the Secretary of Education, that nomination is a piece of specific legislation. Specific legislation include, so those are things that are fairly obvious. However, just because something has not yet been introduced doesn't mean it's not lobbying. If you have a bill that you, or sort of a draft bill, and you're looking for a legislator to introduce it, talking with legislators about why they should introduce a bill is considered to be expressing a view about specific legislation. Talking to legislators about why they shouldn't introduce a bill is considered to be expressing a view about specific legislation. And this is often where, but figuring out where the line is between specific legislation and an issue is in many cases where it's where the rubber meets the road. And this can be sort of the biggest question that comes up. So if you're talking with legislators, whether at the federal, state, local level, about the, as you're talking about the importance of recess and why that's not just a fun thing to do, but how it's really critical for, learning and for child development, and saying that, we need to make sure that recess is an important piece of the school day, and we need to make sure that schools value recess. That may be a policy conversation you're having with a legislator, but it's not considered to be specific legislation, because talking about the importance of recess and even telling a legislator, we need to make sure schools have, incorporate recess into their day, that can be done through a lot of different ways. There's nothing concrete about what a legislature should do. On the other hand, if you were to talk to legislators and say, we need to have a minimum of 30-minute break during the day for kids in kindergarten through 12th grade, and we need you to introduce a bill that says we can do that, now you're talking about specific legislation. I thought this was a great example of a group of students from Pennsylvania that are sort of learning about lobbying and working to try to get a bill passed to require recess. So again, talking about an issue with policymakers isn't lobbying. And for foundations, a lot of what you may do, you may meet with policymakers, you may meet with legislators and talk about issues that are part of your portfolios, talk about what your grantees are doing, talking about what the issues are. And that by itself is not lobbying. It only becomes lobbying when you sort of break it down into a solution and you say, we want you legislator to address this issue by taking action on this bill or on a particular bill. So again, we can spend, and this is often where, again, the tricky part is when does something become talking about an issue? When does something become talking about recess in general to, we want a bill that mandates 30 minutes break a day, where's that line? But does that make sense?
It makes sense to me. I have a bit of a question. Just from my seat over at the Community Foundation, where we have a lot of donor advised funds, which is a pretty widely unregulated system. And if I'm correct, private foundations who can, have very limited lobbying ability can make contributions into a donor advised fund. If they did that and then money left the fund for purposes of lobbying, does that free them up? Like, do they then get to operate under our status as 501c3 since essentially we own the assets?
So that's a great question. And my answer to so many things is it depends. And a lot of it will be, so donor advised funds are part of a public charity, and donor advised funds can spend money on lobbying. The issue becomes how the funds are contributed to the donor advised fund and what limitations or restrictions are on the money or on the funds when they're given to the donor advised fund. And so sometimes foundations will say, and we'll talk more about this after lunch, about sort of grant making. Sometimes foundations will say, here's a general support grant, do with it what you wish. And in that case, those funds could be spent on lobbying. Many times, however, foundations make grants and say, here's a grant, but you can't use any of these funds for lobbying. And then the grantee has to abide by those limitations. So it really becomes, for organizations that operate donor advised funds, other types of pass-through, pooled funds, other types of pass-throughs, a lot of it has to do with how the money is given and what are the conditions when the money is given, because those conditions stay with the money when it's sort of re-granted out.
Right.
And Kelly, and I'm sure Abby will talk about this later, and Abby, let me know if I'm getting this wrong, but I think one observation I would have from having been involved in this work is a lot of what Abby's talking about are the restrictions that would apply directly to what your foundation itself can say and do. But when it comes to your grant making, they're actually, depending on what, like she said, depending on what you put in a grant agreement, your dollars can do different things than what you yourself as an organization can do. So
Exactly.
there's good latitude on the grant making side that may not be there for, if a foundation wanted to step out and support specific legislation, they couldn't. But when it comes to grant making, there's a lot more room there.
So, I mean, even something like what you've got up on the screen, and this is probably like in the gray area, right? Like a letter or an article that says blah, 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 we support this piece of legislation. Can that be authored by a fund instead of necessarily by a foundation?
Probably. And hold that thought. I'm
Okay.
going to get to that in 1 second. So again, some of this, sorry, Tim.
Oh, Abby, I was just going to jump in. From the Kauffman Foundation's perspective, so while that may be a legal activity, you might make the argument that that's completely legal. I think we would have an ethics question, and I would tell you that one of the reasons why donor advised funds are under such scrutiny is people look at it and say, "Oh, private foundations are skirting the law by using DAFs," and so. There's probably a difference between is it legal and is that something that should be allowed or done? And I would tell you the Kauffman Foundation would not do that. My boss likes to use a term, he calls it laundering money. And he says that if you do that, you put it in a DAF and then you use it to do things you can't do directly, you're just laundering money. And so we'd have a pretty strong policy internally for us that would say we can't do that kind of activity.
Sorry, I
And
guess I
that's
should clarify. I was thinking back to the days when we were doing kind of like the pooled giving together, where all of us were kind of coming in together. So that's kind of where that thought came from. I wasn't in the tax evasion and the money laundering, but I can see where that also would be a.
Well, and some of it is, and again, that's a fine line, and that goes into some of the risk. And I think you're absolutely right. There's a difference between what's legal, and what foundations want to do. And as we'll get into, particularly when it comes to grant making, there may be things that the law allows foundations to do that foundations choose not to do. But then there are also ways, again, to do some types of strategic grant making that, some groups are comfortable with, others aren't, but we'll get into talking a lot more about that.
Abby, I just wanted to share an observation, and you've made this point, I think, a couple of times, but the definitions that you went through are very precise and very specific. And in terms of advocacy and the kinds of things that we can do, there's almost no limitation as long as your goal here isn't to go and comment on legislation. If what you're really trying to do is get a bill passed, there's limitations on that, but there's so much you can do beyond saying, hey, Kauffman supports this bill and we think you should pass it. In fact, that's not generally what we're trying to accomplish at the foundation, but if that's our purpose, the law says we can't do it, but we can do anything besides that precise activity. And I think that's something important to remember. We go to this definition because we have to know what that prescription is, but we can do so much that's not that.
Absolutely. And thank you for that. I did a training for a group a few weeks ago, and they got very frustrated that I was spending so much time talking about what was lobbying. And they didn't seem to understand that I was spending so much time talking about what was lobbying, because if it's not lobbying, then it's advocacy. And again, and this gets into, as you were saying, there are a lot of reasons why, as foundations, as you think about the work that you're doing, and, and a lot of this comes into how you talk about the work that you're doing. I was looking at a proposal, somebody had sent me a proposal a few weeks ago to look at, and now I don't even remember what the issue was, or I think they were talking about earned income tax credits. But they sort of were talking about all of their work, and it was sort of the way it was written. It was like all of our goal is to get this earned income tax credit passed. And then they talked about under that, public education and all these other things they were doing. And I said, wait a minute, if you want the foundation that they were applying to fund it, you can't focus on and say your entire goal is to get the bill passed. That may be a piece of what you're doing, but a lot of it is you're doing this work for other purposes. And so it's thinking about, often how you sort of talk about the work you're doing is just as important as what you're doing. And if everything is couched under for the rubric of our ultimate goal is to get this bill passed, that may be problematic for private foundations. But so much of the work is about changing public opinion, about changing public perception of things. And, so much of that work really stands on its own. So for direct lobbying, we're talking about communications with legislators that express a view about specific legislation. Most of the time when we're talking about direct lobbying, it's communications that are to legislators. Ballot measures fall into a sort of wacky place in the law. Ballot measures, whether it's the Missouri 23-cent cigarette tax initiative or Proposition A, ballot measures are treated as specific legislation. So Proposition A is a piece of specific legislation. But who determines whether a ballot measure passes or fails? It's not members of the Missouri legislature, it's the Missouri voters. So most of the time when we have communications to the public, they will fall under the grassroots lobbying category that I'll talk about in just a minute. But except for ballot measures are always considered to be direct lobbying. So if an organization is encouraging people to support or oppose a ballot measure, that is going to be lobbying, and it's going to be direct lobbying. There are, and this makes it, in many cases, there are some challenges, and we can talk more about it this afternoon, about how private foundations can fund ballot measure work. But ballot measure work is considered to be lobbying. And this is an area too where most of the time, federal tax law governs ballot measure work as lobbying. The states regulate ballot measure work under their campaign finance schemes. And this is an area where public charities can get involved in ballot measure campaigns. But this is an area too where we often see ballot measure work being done by 501c4 organizations. And it's often because sort of the whole purpose of working on a ballot measure is considered to be lobbying. And oftentimes the money that's spent on a ballot initiative campaign will sort of dwarf the lobbying limit for a C3. And so ballot measure campaigns are often created as 501c4 organizations. And there are ways that, again, C3s can support lobby, public charities can support lobbying. There are ways that C3s and C4s can work together, and we can talk more about that. But just to know that ballot measures for tax law purposes are considered to be lobbying. Now, again, specific legislation are bills that have to be voted on by the legislative body, whether it's a nomination, whether it's the budget. A lot of the policy work that is done doesn't require legislative votes. So if an organization is trying to influence the regulatory process, trying to influence an agency's policies, rules, practices, that is not considered to be lobbying. If you're trying to get the president to issue an executive order or the governor to take executive action, and if that doesn't need to go through the legislative process, it's not considered to be lobbying. Looking at enforcement of existing laws, not considered to be lobbying. Engaging in litigation, not considered to be lobbying. So again, a lot of the policy work that groups do, and frankly, a lot of the policy work that funders may do in terms of working with people at the agency level and having conversations, isn't considered to be lobbying. Because again, for federal tax law purposes, lobbying is not about whether a policy is enacted or not. It's really about the process for getting there. And if something needs a legislative vote, it's likely will be lobbying. But if the policy can be enacted without having to go through that legislative vote process, then it's not going to be lobbying. I should say, and I know it's about time to break for lunch, but this is an area, and we are talking today about federal tax law. This is the body of law that governs 501c3 organizations, 501c4 organizations, 501c6 organizations. Every state also regulates lobbying. And every state defines lobbying differently. And every state defines lobbying differently from each other, as well as defining lobbying differently from federal tax law. The states don't say how much lobbying an organization can do. The states say, if you engage in what we consider to be lobbying, you may need to register as a lobbyist, or you may need to report with the state, and every state is different. Most states, when they define lobbying, include executive branch activity under the state definition of lobbying. So for most states, if an organization is trying to work with the Department of Education on internal policy, that under state law, that may be considered to be lobbying. But under 501c3 law, it's not. And we could spend hours sort of talking about this, but what this means is that there's some activity that a private foundation could do. There are conversations that the Kauffman Foundation could have with the Department of Education, the State Department of Education, where under tax law, they could legally say, we're not lobbying at all. Yet they still may have to report to the state of Missouri that, yes, we did some lobbying through these conversations. And it's because the same word lobbying is used in different ways and means different things. But today we're really talking about the federal tax law and what the limitations are. Again, the state doesn't limit anything, and the state rules aren't based on whether you're a private foundation, whether you're a public charity, whether you're a C4. The state rules apply to everybody equally. They apply to for-profits the same way. And so, but they don't have any limitations. It's a matter of disclosure. Let me just see if there are any questions about that. And then if it makes sense, we can either continue on and sort of finish out the definition of lobbying, or we can stick to the schedule and take our lunch break.
I have a quick question about this concept of disclosure.
Yep.
I get what you're saying. I'm trying to understand what that means in very practical terms, like how much do you have to track that type of activity? What kind of documentation do you need? Who are you actually providing that to? So that I'm a little fuzzy on.
And there's a good reason that you're fuzzy on that, because it depends. And every state is different. And
Yeah.
every state has different, again, different definitions, different filing deadlines, different levels of detail that's required. And so we can, if you have specific questions, follow up with me and we can get that information. But that's one of the areas that makes it real, is a real challenge for groups that, particularly groups that do work in multiple states, because the rules are very different.
Tim, not to put you on the spot, but like, since we have our counsel on on our call, is that something that we at all participate in as the foundation, or has that not been necessary because we just haven't?
No, we
dealt
don't.
with
It would be like, it's a possibility that you have to register as a state lobbyist and still not be violating the IRS rules, but it's kind of a funny look for a foundation to be registered as a lobbyist and then argue that it's not lobbying. So I would just say we would not be going to any legislatures and participating in suggesting that they pass legislation. Anything that we would do would be in the vein of like education or passing along information, talking about our opinions, but not expressing a view on the actual legislation and all the things I think Abby's going to talk about here in a few minutes. Those would be our activities, so we wouldn't have to register.
I guess what struck me a little bit is when we're talking about regulatory, because I know for the real world learning team, just as a very concrete example, they've come across, and I know this is focused on early ed, so sorry, I'm bringing in a different kind of
Not at all.
work, but we have a specific team that has been talking a lot to state departments about regulatory opportunities that would create more options for the work they're trying to move forward in schools. So again, that's what kind of struck me, is like, again, not legislative, obviously, predominantly focused on regulatory. Is that, but since you kind of had it on this list, I'm like, is that something that then needs to be somehow documented and shared or not?
Well, I would say Abby kind of hit this a little bit earlier, that the regulatory stuff is generally not considered lobbying. And so
Right.
I don't think we would be worried. I would imagine we've talked about that various times with that team. And so I don't think we would worry about registration as a lobbyist, or that we're crossing the IRS laws, just talking about the regulatory stuff.
Okay, all right. I guess I was having a disconnect between the slide that I'm looking at and then the talking points. So, but that makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah, I guess maybe just to make sure I'm clear on what you just said, Miles, but what's on the screen now are the things that would not be legislation. So talking about these things would not be considered, wouldn't be issues.
Right.
No, I know. I realized that. I think I thought Abby was saying that these things are.
You're on
Oh, we
mute.
lost you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
You
Yes.
cut off for a second, you're back.
So that these things are obviously not legislative and therefore allowable for C3s to be a part of. Where I got a disconnect was I thought that Abby was saying, or Abby, I thought you were saying that you still need to document them, even though they're not.
It
lobbyist activity.
depends. And again, this is where each state is different. And, some states require, and this is where we could, sort of go in lots of directions. And I can follow up with you in terms of looking at,
Okay.
some of the work in.
So I think it
In
would
the
be,
particular
for
state.
IRS purposes, you don't have to report on this. Like, it's really enlightening to see the actual IRS form that 501c3s have to file at the end of the year, because it really just has a question that's like, did you spend any money on lobbying? And if so, was it a 501h, or what is your tax status and how much? So the IRS is really only concerned about lobbying. But I think what Abby's referencing is like in the state of Missouri, if you're going to be doing a lot of administrative or executive branch lobbying, you actually might have to register with the Missouri Ethics Department. But there's even that there's sort of a little fuzziness around if you're lobbying and it's just incidental here and there, you're not actually an administrative branch lobbyist. But if you're there every day sitting in the governor's lobby trying to lobby him or her about something, then you're an administrative lobbyist. So there's sort of a set of rules with the IRS, and they're really only concerned about the lobbying piece. And then there's a different set of rules for each state that might care about what you're doing regulatory or executive side.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. Abby, do you want to finish out this? Are folks good with letting Abby finish this out, and then we'll still make sure we have 30 minutes for lunch?
Perfect. And I apologize if people put questions or anything in the chat box. I can't necessarily see the chat box while I'm sharing my screen. So if there was anything that you don't feel like I'm ignoring you on purpose. So we've just been talking about direct lobbying, which are communications with legislators. So writing a letter to a legislator, picking up the phone and calling a legislator. A lot of the work, again, that organizations do in terms of thinking about policy isn't talking to legislators. It could be, as I think somebody talked about earlier, putting something up on your website, comment, whether you think a bill is good or bad, writing an op-ed in the newspaper, doing a TV interview, having a public education forum with people in the community. In order for something to be grassroots lobbying, again, where you're communicating with the public, except for when we're talking about ballot measures that still fall under that direct lobbying. Now, not only do we need to express a view about specific legislation, but there's this extra element that's needed. In order for a communication to the public to constitute lobbying, there needs to be a call to action. And again, call to action is one of these terms that is used in a lot of different ways, but the legal definition is very limited. And so a call to action is where you are saying, call your legislator and tell them to support this bill, or you provide the legislator's contact information, or you provide a way for people to contact their legislators, like an online form for people to fill out, or you list the legislators or identify the legislators who are opposing the bill or have not yet taken a position on the bill or that represent the group that you're communicating to. If your communication does not have one of these calls to action, the communication isn't lobbying, which means that a public charity could have a section on policy on their website where they're looking at various bills and saying, all right, these are the bills that we care about, or these are the bills we're following, not lobbying. They can go a step further and say, we think this bill is good, we think this bill is bad, not lobbying. You can write a letter to the editor talking about why the bill to mandate recess is really important, not lobbying, unless you include one of these calls to action. So again, and if it's not lobbying, private foundations can do it too. So this doesn't mean that private foundations can't have any positions about bills, that it doesn't mean that private foundations can't learn, know what's going on in the legislature, or that they can't even express their view on it. The audience is critical. So there's a big difference in what gets put on a letter that gets sent directly to legislators, or whether you're asked to sign on to a sign-on letter that gets sent to legislators, or whether it's a communication that's meant to go to the general public. And having that call to action is really, really important. So let's look at an example. So here we have an example, and this ad is so old, but it never gets old. And with COVID, it seems like it's taken on a whole new context. But here it talks about sort of no paid sick days for restaurant employees. And we have a lovely enhanced dining experience for restaurant customers. And then it says nearly half of all workers in Maine lack paid sick days. Support your fellow Maine workers and their right to recover from illness without endangering public health or losing a day's pay. Contact your legislator and share your support of LD 1454, the paid sick days bill. So what do you think? Is this lobbying? Yep.
I would say yes, because it referenced an actual bill.
Yeah. So would this be direct lobbying, grassroots lobbying?
Grassroots.
Yeah, so this was an ad. So this was an ad in the paper. So this is classic grassroots lobbying. It's a communication with the public. It expresses a view about a bill. It talks about the paid sick days bill. It has the bill number. And then it says, contact your legislator and share your support. This is classic grassroots lobbying.
But if you remove that last part of contact your legislator, that whole thing would not be considered lobbying, correct?
Absolutely, exactly. And
So
so
you could have the
here's
exact
another
same thing.
Yep. And so here is another, so yes, if you had this ad and you just got rid of the, contact your legislator and share your support, not lobbying. So here's another ad in the same series. She'll be your server tonight and she's pretty sure it's contagious. Nearly half of all workers in Maine lack paid sick days and are forced to work through their illness in order to pay the bills. Support LD 1454, the paid sick days bill. What do you think?
Lobbying,
Okay, why?
because it references a bill number and
Okay.
a bill title, an official bill name.
So if this were something that were being sent directly to the legislator, yep, this would be direct lobbying. It's referencing a bill and expresses a view on it. But if this is a communication to the public, it is a communication with the public, it expresses a view about a bill. But is there a call to action on here?
No,
Yeah.
because it's not saying to contact their legislator. It's just saying to
Exactly.
support.
Yep. So this technically does not have a call to action on it. Now, this is one where that may be close to the line. And, I'm looking at, some foundations may say, oh, no, this is too close to the line. But technically, there is no call to action on here. If you went, and one of my favorite parts about this ad is their website, mainsneezes.org. If you were to type in that website and it's like, achoo, call your legislator and tell them to support the bill. If you're now sending, so let's say we say, all right, there's no call to action in this ad, but now we're sending someone directly to a call to action, that would be attributed back. But again, this is where it's okay to comment, to reference a bill. The Kauffman Foundation could, and again, this is where there's the difference between what the law allows and what each foundation's comfort level is. But legally could write an op-ed talking about the importance of, for the bill, for the paid sick days bill, and why it's so important to the state and it's critical for workers to be able to, and for our economy to be able to work well. And if there's no call to action, technically it's not grassroots lobbying.
What about if the call to action is, contact your legislator, but it's not about a specific bill. It's just like contact your legislator to tell them why you think it's important, that folks have paid sick leave or whatever.
Great question. And so again, in order for something to be lobbying, it needs to meet all of the elements. So it needs to be a communication with the public that expresses a view about specific legislation and has that call to action. So if you're asking people, and we see this all, a lot, where there are calls to action where it says, call your legislator and tell them about how you've been affected by how COVID is affecting you, or contact your legislators and tell them about, if you're facing eviction issues. Again, urging people to contact legislators about issues is not lobbying. It's only when you're encouraging people to contact legislators to express a view about legislation. We also see groups often sending notes out or saying, call the, and we saw this a lot with, the census, call the secretary or, write to the Secretary of Commerce and tell them to extend the deadline on the census. That may have been a communication to the public asking people to do something, but again, it wasn't about specific legislation. So we need all of those elements for something to be considered to be lobbying. And I know this is sort of a lot. And, I'll say that, we have lots of resources on our website that talk about this. We have some flow charts that I can send that sort of walk through some of these definitions. And we also we're available. And so you'll get all of my contact information. We also have a hotline. And so if you have questions about, oh, does this seem like lobbying? You don't feel like you should call your general counsel, you should talk to your colleagues. But if you want to get another opinion, feel free to reach out to us. And you don't feel like you need to know the answers to all of this. A lot of this is for you to understand sort of where those where the things are that you should be thinking about, what questions to be asking, and often in thinking about this, and this gets back to one of the points Jess made earlier, to be thinking about, okay, this is what you want to do. And then to talk, whether you call us, whether it's to your counsel, and say, okay, the bill is happening or this policy issue is going on. We want to get involved. How can we do it? And don't just go and say, can we sign on to this letter? Or can we write this? Because then it's easy for them to be like, nope, all right, done there, moving on. But really to say, this issue is really important. This is critical to the work of our program. What can we do? How can we do it? And there's so many ways that you can get involved. Tim, were you about to say something?
Well, I was going to say, well, first of all, I have used Boulder advocacy materials many times, so I second that. Like, there's so many good resources that you all make public, so I would encourage people to use them. There's such good explanations and really good and clear things. I was just going to say that I love this example that you have on the screen because I think it also shows that context often matters. So like this ad, if we ran it in the Kansas City Star, no problem. But if we ran it in the Missouri Congressional House Journal and this was going to legislators, this ad would be problematic. Likewise, if this wasn't about a bill in the Senate, but it was about a ballot initiative, hey, pass the early childhood income tax or a property tax bill that's pending to be voted on in November, this kind of an ad would be problematic if you said, hey, support this ballot initiative. So I really like how you've laid it out and showing how the context and the particular usage really matters.
Can I throw one other scenario out, even though I know
Sure.
we spiraled down this for hours?
No, this is where, the context really does matter. And this is where, we can talk about all of the stuff in the abstract, but until we really drill down into the type of work and the scenarios that you're actually dealing with, it can not make a lot of sense. So bring it on.
Okay, thank you. And this isn't really all that hypothetical because we get asked sometimes by our advocacy partners if we are willing to testify on an issue they know is important to us at the State House, and the testimony is provided during a hearing on a bill. And so the way I understood it was that there are ways, like if I went to you, Tim, and said, there's a bill that's really, like, what happens with it is going to be really important to the work we do at the foundation. I would like to go and provide testimony on it as a foundation representative, but my testimony itself is educational in nature, or, it's not referencing a bill. It's just about the issue at hand that is important to us. So is that something that is possible? And if so, what would we have to be thinking about?
Well, so Holly, you're in an area where there's a lot of nuance here. And so I would say this is something I want you to talk with John, my boss, about, or come talk to me about. But there are exceptions, like if we're invited to make commentary on it by the legislature, there's a chance we can do it. So, but if you're wanting to volunteer and step in and just comment on the legislation and say, hey, Foundation supports the passage of this, we think you should, here's all the reasons why, that would be a problematic activity. If you're just sending flyers saying, here's all our research that's out there, you should review this research before you vote, that's probably okay. So there's lots of ways to do it. The circumstances matter and what it is that you want to say. And so I think that would be something you'd want to have coordinated with legal counsel. That'd be my recommendation. Abby, do you have other thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I was just going to say, and I just will move to that there are various exceptions and carve outs in the law that, and one of them is an exception for technical assistance. But and this requires an organization being invited to come testify. So if a legislative committee sent a letter, and it needs to be in writing, that said, we know you're an expert on early childhood education and we think your advice would be really helpful on this bill. Can you please come testify? It's very possible that then you could go testify. You could be sitting there in front of the committee and it's not considered to be lobbying, but there are specific rules and criteria that need to be met for that exception to apply. It's not enough that one legislator calls you and says, hey, what do you think about this? And so, there are, again, this is where the devil's in the detail. There's also an exception where, and we see foundations doing this a lot, or funding research that may ultimately take a position on a particular bill or on a particular issue. But if the report is done where there's a full and fair discussion of the issue and it's broadly disseminated, then there could be a report that gets sent to lawmakers that express a view on bills. And this nonpartisan analysis exception is one that, again, foundations use all the time in terms of supporting research, that all the research, that if an organization, if a grantee does all this research to determine, let's go back to the recess example, to look at what is the data showing, is recess good, is it necessary? They do all that research and they come to the conclusion that yes, and therefore we need a bill that mandates, an hour of recess every day. And they then call legislators and say, we've done this research, we need you to introduce this bill. All of the research that was done, which often has a lot of costs because a lot of time is spent on doing all that research, all of that will count as lobbying. On the other hand, if the organization does all this research and they say, okay, and then they write a report and they say, we've looked at all of these studies, and they put out this report saying, these are why recess is good. These are a few of the drawbacks. This is what the findings say. And say, as a result, we think legislature, all schools should have recess and we need a bill to do that. And they put that report out. Now, all of the costs of doing that research won't be considered lobbying. If the organization then goes and calls a legislator and says, hey, we want you to introduce this bill, that conversation will be lobbying, but all of the work that brought them up to that point won't be. So again, there are a lot of ways that, again, that can make this type of work possible. And it's really thinking about what role do you want to play? And, Hallie, your example that you had about testifying, this is where there are some differences in terms of what private foundations can do, what grantees can do, and, knowing sort of where your limits are, and sometimes saying, we're not the best person, we're not the best person to do this, but, and this is where the grantees could be front and center, and they can be sort of doing that.
Yeah, and Hallie, I might just, you probably know Jason Weens and the Start Up Coalition, but one of the things that they do is they train other people to go out and do this. They might say, to Abby's point, there are some really good grantees that would be fantastic people to speak. here's the messaging that you can use. Here's all our research. We'd encourage you to go do it. We can't coordinate the messaging, but getting other people to go do that on our behalf using our information actually might be a stronger strategy in those cases. But if you did want to testify, we'd want to talk about what you're going to say and all that, just to be cognizant of the issues Abby's talking about.
And so again, sometimes it's not the message, it's who the messenger is. And if it's done by a public charity, it has one, you know, it's perfectly legal. If it's done by a private foundation, it could look different. Yep, Miles.
Sorry, yeah, quick question about that. So, you know, I think a perfect example, let's say, is like the domestic workers union, you know, cultivates their members to go and speak to legislators about conditions for domestic workers. As a foundation, if you were going to, let's say, write a grant to that group, now that might be a little tricky because they're definitely not they may have a C3 side, but they definitely have a C4 side. So there's always those things to navigate. But can you, as a foundation, invest in a group that is getting folks to carry a message directly to legislators? And where's the shaky ground there, if any?
Yes, you absolutely can. And that seems like a great break. And we can, after lunch, we can come back and talk about that. Because again, there's a big difference between a message that you're delivering yourself and what organizations you can fund and how you can fund organizations to do that.
All right, we will take that as our lunch break. I know we're a little bit past, but we'll, I'm starving. Abby, it's like an hour later for you. I'm sure you're starving. So we're gonna break. We will reconvene. I'll leave the Zoom link here open. I'll cancel the recording, but we'll come back by 12:30 sharp. Abby will dive in on some of the grant making stuff. Does that work for folks? Okay.
Perfect.
Thank you.